Good evening, I'm Amna Nawaz.
And I'm Jeff Bennett. On the NewsHour tonight, Pope Francis passes away at age 88, leaving behind a legacy of change and a reshaped Catholic Church.
The Secretary of Defense faces mounting calls to resign after new reports of his sending attack details on a commercial messaging app.
And the U.S. Supreme Court hears a challenge to the Affordable Care Act's requirement that private insurance companies cover preventive care.
If you take away this no-cost access, the people are much less likely to get these screenings and to take this medicine.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Leonard and Norma Chlorfine, and the Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation.
Certified financial planner professionals are proud to support PBS NewsHour. CFP professionals are committed to acting in their clients' best interest. More information at letsmakeaplan.org.
It really matters when you have an opportunity to give back.
Being part of something that's bigger than myself, that's what brings me happiness.
Being able to integrate your professional career with some of these other things that are important to you, it's critical to be happy at the end of the day.
This is our community too, and we want to participate and give back to it.
People want those opportunities to make an impact and a difference.
The Ford Foundation, working with visionaries on the front lines of social change worldwide. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. The world is mourning the death of Pope Francis, who passed away at his residence this Easter Monday. Throughout his papacy, he was often hailed and sometimes criticized for his efforts to reshape the Catholic Church.
His death comes one day after the Pope greeted crowds and delivered a short message on Easter Sunday. The Vatican said his death was caused by a cerebral stroke that led to a coma and irreversible heart failure. He was 88 years old. Across the globe, reactions have poured in, remembering Pope Francis. Bells rang in St. Peter's Square today, and mourners quickly gathered to mark the death of Pope Francis.
He was not only a pope for the religious people, but also for the non-believers and for the poor. He was important, and he was open-minded and had attention for the environment and for cultures.
It's a great disappointment, a great loss. A man who has innovated the church and a man who has left a great mark.
Catholic churches held services in honor of Francis, the first Jesuit pope and the first from Latin America. Many praised his efforts to steer the church in a more inclusive direction.
It's truly a feeling of sadness. We remain very attached to him. He was truly a pope we had the chance to meet, to approach.
Flags were lowered in many countries, including the U.S., where President Trump spoke during the annual Easter egg roll at the White House.
I just signed an executive order putting the flags of our country, all of them, all federal flags and state flags, at half-mast in honor of Pope Francis. So he was a good man, worked hard, he loved the world.
In Brazil and in Argentina, where the Pope was born, a week of mourning began. Leaders around the world paid tribute.
Throughout his pontificate, he stood alongside the most vulnerable, the most fragile, with great humility and a very special sense, in these times of war and brutality, a very special sense of the other and of the most fragile.
Pope Francis was a humanist, a man who was always close to the humblest, to the poor. So it is a painful loss.
Many religious leaders spoke of his compassion and his outreach. The Archbishop of New York, Cardinal Timothy Dolan, said the timing was striking.
You couldn't choreograph it any better than what happened. The last time we saw him, Easter Sunday, the last words, a blessed Easter, as he gave us his blessing. The way he lived and the way he died, he was a great teacher.
Francis's 12-year-long papacy was in many ways a remarkable one, working in service to the church until the very day before he died. Pope Francis sought to focus more explicitly on social justice, on climate change, and addressing the most marginalized in society.
But he also faced pressure for actions that some say fell short of his public remarks, undercut commitments, or went too far for some Catholics. Stephanie Tsai has a look back at his life and work.
Gaudium Magnum. Habemus Papa.
He was a symbol of change and hope for the Catholic Church. In March of 2013, Bishop Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Argentina was elected pontiff at the age of 76.
Thank you so much for your welcome. Please pray for me.
He was a disruptor from the outset, the first pope from the Southern Hemisphere, the first Jesuit pope, and the first to choose the papal name Francis, after the saint who renounced his privilege to follow God. It was fitting for a man who, even as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, lived in a modest apartment and rode the bus. Francis followed the late Pope Benedict XVI, the first pope to resign in 600 years. Unlike his scholarly predecessor, Francis was known for his pastoral approach, says Natalia Imperatori Lee, who runs the Religious Studies Department at Manhattan College.
He is committed to what is known as the signs of the times. And Francis, with his papal priorities, the climate, migration, has really sort of looked at the world as it is, right? The grief of the world, the hope of the world, the joys of the world, and the anxieties of the world, and thought, how can the church bring attention to this?
Early in his pontificate, Francis made the first of what would become regular impromptu comments during back-of-plane news conferences that would spark headlines. This remark about homosexuality.
If someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge?
He maintained homosexual acts were sinful, but for queer Catholics, Francis signaled positive change. And he went farther than other popes, formally allowing priests to bless same-sex couples.
In the end, Pope Francis didn't really change any doctrines regarding gay people, but he said that we are all sinners. He put everybody on the same level.
David Gibson, the director of the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University, says when it came to calling for urgent action on climate change, Francis called the planet our common home.
That, if anything, was his social justice priority, because he believed so strongly in a culture of life, but a culture of all life. He redefined pro-life as life from womb to tomb, but around the planet.
Francis opened and expanded dialogue on whether divorced and remarried Catholics could partake in communion, on the morality of contraception, and on the role of women in church leadership. He ultimately dismissed the idea of women becoming priests or deacons. But under him, the most recent church synod, traditionally a summit of bishops, included lay people and women. That led in part to this thinly veiled criticism by American Cardinal Raymond Burke.
Today's bishops and cardinals need a great deal of courage to confront the grave errors that come from within the church itself.
Francis sidelined Burke and other dissenters.
Towards the end of his papacy, Pope Francis was getting a bit fed up with the conservative critics, especially those based in the United States. I mean, they weren't just criticizing him. They were saying he was an apostate, saying he was a heretic. They were setting themselves up almost as anti-popes.
Francis inherited the sexual abuse epidemic infecting the church, and like his predecessors, he fumbled his way through it. In early 2018, Francis visited Chile to apologize for the sexual abuse of dozens of minors over decades by Father Fernando Karadima.
I cannot but manifest the pain and the shame that I feel for the irreparable damage done to children by church ministers.
But his apology was overshadowed by his defense of Bishop Juan Barros, who had been accused of covering up the abuse. Francis told accusers they needed to provide proof. On the plane home, he apologized, but the damage was real.
And his words really hurt survivors in real ways. It caused material harm to them to not be believed, again, at the highest levels of the church.
During his papacy, he expanded rules for internal policing and prosecuting sex abuse cases. Francis was welcomed by leaders near and far on his papal missions. On a trip to Canada, he apologized for the Catholic Church's role in the cultural genocide of Indigenous tribes. And in 2015, he came to the U.S., where he became the first pope to address Congress with a soaring vision of an America united in compassion.
We must move forward together as one in a renewed spirit of fraternity and solidarity, cooperating generously for the common good.
He sought to elevate the church's influence on moral issues until the very end. In an open letter to American bishops, he recently called the Trump administration's mass deportation policy, quote, a major crisis that damages the dignity of many men and women and of entire families.
So good to see you.
The issue wasn't reported to have come up during U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance's brief meeting with him on Sunday. Vance, a Catholic, is the last known world leader to have met with the Pope. After the meeting, Pope Francis spent his final full day among the masses gathered at St. Peter's Square for Easter. Whether France's approach and his efforts to shift the church on some key issues will continue to have impact is an open question.
Was Pope Francis a success? The only way we can tell is who walks out on the balcony as the next pope. Will it be somebody who continues that legacy, who walks through the door that Pope Francis opened? Or is it somebody who's going to close that door?
Pope Francis died at the age of 88.
Fratelli e sorelle, buonasera.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Stephanie Tsai.
The death of a pope and the election of a new pontiff is adorned with high ritual and elaborate ceremony, as these passings and renewals have for centuries. For more on how the church will celebrate and mourn Francis and what comes next, we're joined by special correspondent Malcolm Brabant, who is in Rome for us tonight. So, Malcolm, how are people there remembering and mourning Pope Francis tonight?
Well, it's midnight here in Rome tonight, and so the atmosphere is rather serene. Throughout the course of the day, thousands of people have been traipsing into the Vatican to pay their respects to a man who was both a colossus and also a very humble kind of parish priest, even though he held the highest office in the Catholic Church, leading 1.4 billion Catholics around the world. So there's a great sense of sorrow that a great man has passed away. And there's also a sense of admiration for the courage that he has displayed as he fought the illness over the past few months, and the fact that he managed to eke out his life to the most important date in the Christian calendar, Easter, before giving that blessing in St. Peter's just behind me yesterday, saying that wishing people happy Easter, and people felt very much that he was saying goodbye to them. And so there's a great sense of loss, but not shock.
Walk us through what comes next, the timeline for the funeral and the burial, and the church picking a successor.
what's going to happen tomorrow is that cardinals from all around the world are going to gather to decide on the date of the funeral, and that has to take place between up to 6 days after his death was announced. So we're looking at possibly Friday, Saturday or Sunday. The decision will be made tomorrow. And then on Wednesday, the Pope will be lying in state until his funeral in the magnificent cathedral behind me, and millions of people are expected to come and attend his funeral, as they did at the last great funeral here. But there's absolutely no guarantee, though, that his final wishes will be respected. He has said in his will that he wishes to be buried in a very simple grave in a church called St. Maria Maggiore, which is a basilica outside the Vatican. And he wants to be buried in a very simple tomb, just with Franciscus on it. And this is a very special place. It's a place that possesses a piece of wood from Jesus' manger in Bethlehem. So it's a very sort of relatively humble place compared to the Vatican behind me, where so many more popes are buried.
Malcolm Brabant in Rome for us tonight. Malcolm, thank you.
And for some more perspective on the life and legacy of Pope Francis, we turn now to Reverend Thomas Reese, senior analyst for Religion News Service and author of Inside the Vatican, the Politics and Organization of the Catholic Church. Father Reese, welcome back to the NewsHour. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So Francis was a lot of firsts, as we just heard there. The first Jesuit pope, the first Latin American pope, the first non-European pope in more than a millennium. How did all of those firsts translate into his worldview and how he led, what he sought to do with his time in the papacy?
Well, I think his background really helped shape his papacy. Coming from the global south, of course, he was very interested in issues of justice and peace. He was really concerned about the impact of globalization on poor people around the world. He was concerned about migrants and refugees that had to flee from war zones and poverty in the global south. And he was very concerned about how they were treated when they came north. So these are the kinds of things that had an impact on him that came from his personal background of coming from the global south itself.
He was seen by many as a progressive to some degree, but it's fair to say that even many liberals were disappointed that he didn't break from previous stances of the church on things like abortion and birth control or women joining the clergy. In a column today, though, you called him revolutionary in every other way. How so?
Well, I think that's true. He didn't change any doctrine, but he certainly changed the culture of the church. He hated clericalism. He told bishops and priests not to act like princes, but to get down with their people and listen to them and care for them. He also was very happy with having debate and discussion in the church. That may have come from his Jesuit background, because in the previous papacies, if you didn't agree with the Pope, you were silenced. You could lose your job teaching in a seminary. But he welcomed discussion. He was not afraid of having that kind of open discussion because he felt that that was the way the church grew.
He also stepped into the role just as the Vatican was in a bit of disarray after Pope Benedict had stepped down, who was the real standard bearer of Roman Catholic conservatism. And Pope Francis really sought to steer the church in a completely different direction. How did that resonate with the rank and file, with Catholics around the world?
Well, Pope Francis and Pope Benedict were very different people. Pope Benedict, of course, was an academic. He was a scholar, a writer of books and very complex theology. Pope Francis was a pastor. He liked to be with the people. He liked to communicate in words that people could understand, not just scholars. He was able to reach out and touch people in a way that I think had not been done for a long time. And that kind of pastoral approach, that compassionate approach, was something that people found very attractive in him.
When it comes to, of course, the sexual abuse scandal that the church was dealing with as well, after he had some early missteps, Pope Francis really took bigger swings, looking for accountability and trying to build back some of that trust that had been lost. In your view, how did he do on that front? Was he able to build that back?
Nobody in the church has been perfect on dealing with the sex abuse crisis. There was a lot of ignorance. There was a lot of stupidity. But I think Pope Francis learned during his papacy. For example, he went to Chile and just blew it. I mean, he just did not get it. He didn't believe the accusations that were being made. It's like, somebody makes accusations against your brother or your uncle. You find it incomprehensible. But then when he found out it was true, boy, did he get mad. And he made all of the bishops in Chile submit their resignations. He didn't accept them all, but he accepted some of them. And he started going after bishops and saying, you protect your children or you're out. And so that became a new tone in the Catholic Church, which I think was very helpful.
He did have his conservative critics, and he demoted many of them in Vatican leadership and restricted the use of the old Latin Mass. Are those conservative forces now pushing for a return to that more traditional view?
Yes, there are conservative factions within the Church that are pushing to go back to before the Second Vatican Council, to go back to the old Church. They're a small minority. There are, some of the elites, conservative elites, are very vocal and very loud in their criticism of Pope Francis. But if you look at the public opinion polls, 75% of Catholics have a favorable view of Pope Francis. Even Republican Catholics, almost 2/3 of them have a favorable view of Pope Francis. I think that this is a minority view, and his legacy will endure.
Well, the demographics of the Church have certainly changed quite a bit. There are nearly 1.5 billion Catholics in the world. Roughly 80% of them are outside of Europe, about half in the Americas, 20% in Africa, 10% in Asia. What does that mean for the future of the Church and for what the next Pope will inherit?
Well, the word Catholic itself means universal. We are a big tent church. We have people from all cultures, all languages, all areas of the world. Where there are Catholics. So this means that we have to learn how to speak and how to live together. The Catholic Church should be a model for the rest of society of how people can come together, how they can discern and pray and talk and have conversation and not scream at each other, let alone kill each other. The great thing that Pope Francis tried to do with other religious leaders was make religion a force for reconciliation and peace in the world. And I think we can do that because the Catholic Church is present everywhere in the world.
This is the Reverend Thomas Reese of Religion News Service joining us tonight. Father Reese, always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
In the day's other headlines, Russian President Vladimir Putin says fighting has resumed in its war against Ukraine after a 30-hour Easter truce ended. Both sides accuse the other of violating that ceasefire through the weekend. In Kyiv, amid Easter gatherings, residents expressed skepticism about the truce, which Putin unilaterally declared. For his part, President Putin, who has been under pressure from the Trump administration to show more willingness to make peace with Ukraine, indicated Moscow could be open to another longer ceasefire.
As we have always said, we look positively to any peace initiatives. We hope that the representatives of the Kyiv regime will also feel the same way. Overall, still, there has been a reduction in activity. We welcome that, and we are ready to look at the future.
This all comes ahead of another round of talks on Wednesday in London among U.S., Ukrainian, and European officials. In the Middle East, U.S. airstrikes overnight in Yemen's capital city killed at least 12 people and wounded 30 more. It is the latest in a month-long campaign of strikes against Houthi rebels for their attacks on ships in the Red Sea and against Israel. The Houthis, who are affiliated with Iran, say at least 200 people have been killed since U.S. strikes in Yemen intensified in mid-March. The strikes occur against the backdrop of continuing U.S. talks with Iran over its nuclear program. The latest dialogue on Saturday made very good progress, according to the Trump administration. 4 House Democrats are in El Salvador to advocate for Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the Maryland man whom the Trump administration acknowledges it deported there by mistake. Progressive caucus members Yasemin Ansari, Maxine Dexter, Maxwell Frost, and Robert Garcia all urged El Salvador to let Abrego Garcia return. Their trip was not taxpayer funded. On social media, Congresswoman Ansari said the case has implications beyond Abrego Garcia himself.
If there's not due process for Kilmar, there will be no due process for anyone. We want to make sure that the United States does what it's supposed to do, follow the Supreme Court of the United States, and release him.
Last week, Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen also went to El Salvador and unsuccessfully lobbied for Abrego Garcia's release. The White House has called the trips by Democratic lawmakers an apology tour. The Trump administration has not complied with a unanimous Supreme Court ruling ordering it to facilitate Abrego Garcia's return. Harvard this afternoon sued the Trump administration over its recent decision to freeze $2.2 billion of the university's research funding. That funding was halted last week after Harvard became the first major U.S. university to reject a list of White House demands, including federal audits of its programs and screening of international students. The administration has also threatened Harvard's tax-exempt status. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem confirmed to multiple news outlets that she had her purse stolen while dining at a popular restaurant last night in Washington, D.C. Her bag contained $3,000 cash, as well as several forms of ID, like her driver's license, DHS access badge, and passport. The U.S. Secret Service, which provides security for Noem, says it reviewed security camera footage from the night and has launched an investigation. Scattered thunderstorms are rumbling across the country tonight from western New York all the way to the Gulf Coast. That's after severe storms this Easter weekend brought tornadoes and flash floods that killed at least 3 people in Oklahoma. Across that state and in neighboring Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas, heavy winds tore off roofs and toppled power lines. 2 to 4 inches of rain fell in parts of Oklahoma this weekend, and more heavy rain is expected across parts of the Central Plains this week. In Orlando, Florida, all passengers and crew aboard a Delta Airlines flight are safe and accounted for after one of the plane's engines caught fire on the tarmac. Cell phone video showed flames spewing from the Atlanta-bound Airbus shortly after it pushed away from the gate for departure. The nearly 300 passengers were forced to evacuate using the emergency inflatable slides. It's the latest in a string of incidents that have raised questions about U.S. aviation safety. Both Delta and the FAA say they are investigating the cause of the fire. And on Wall Street, stocks were in free fall today over investor concerns about President Trump's tariffs and his recent threats to fire Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. The Dow dropped by nearly 1,000 points. Both government bonds and the value of the U.S. dollar were in retreat, too. The Nasdaq plummeted by more than 400 points, and the S&P fell nearly 125 as all 3 major indices lost more than 2%. Still to come on the NewsHour, Tamara Keith and Amy Walter break down the latest political headlines. And the Trump administration's latest efforts to dismantle climate protections.
This is the PBS NewsHour from the David M. Rubenstein studio at WETA in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
After a weekend of new revelations and headlines, the White House today faced more questions about Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, and at least one Republican lawmaker is now calling on him to resign. Some of this is related to Hegseth's use of the Signal messaging app to text operational details of military action. But our Lisa Desjardins joins us now to report that is not the only issue here. So, Lisa, that sets us up well. Take us through what has transpired in recent days.
A lot to say, so I want to be very clear. Let's start with last Friday. Now, on that day, that is when 4 top Pentagon staffers in Hegseth's inner circle were suddenly out. That includes the top staffer, his chief of staff there, who resigned from that job, as Politico reported, and 3 others who were just below that chief of staff level. All have known him a long time, all accused in the media of leaking and were fired. Next, Sunday, the New York Times reported, and PBS has confirmed, that Hegseth used a second Signal chat in which he messaged sensitive information about that Yemen attack. And per our source, he included in that chat his wife. That's obviously a major breach of security and secrecy protocols. Then also yesterday, Hegseth's former top communications person, his chief spokesperson, John Elliott, wrote an op-ed in Politico saying he needed to go. Now, if you read that op-ed, you saw that Elliott wrote that the Pentagon is no longer focused on war fighting, but on endless drama and chaos. Elliott is a Marine veteran, but he's also a DC communications veteran, so him writing that op-ed is highly unusual and significant.
What are the White House and Hegseth saying today in response to all of this?
They are strongly defending their defense chief. They have said that, in fact, Hegseth himself spoke this morning at the White House Easter egg roll.
This is what the media does. They take anonymous sources from disgruntled former employees, and then they try to slash and burn people and ruin their reputations. Not going to work with me, because we're changing the Defense Department, putting the Pentagon back in the hands of warfighters, and anonymous smears from disgruntled former employees on old news doesn't matter.
But it was not anonymous, as we just reported. His former own communications chief and 3 others have raised questions about this. President Trump, however, said firmly today that he has great confidence. And I also want to point out this from the White House press secretary, who made this statement about Hegseth today.
The president stands strongly behind Secretary Hegseth, who is doing a phenomenal job leading the Pentagon. And this is what happens when the entire Pentagon is working against you and working against the monumental change that you are trying to implement.
The entire Pentagon working against you, obviously, that's hyperbole in one sense, but it also is an incredible statement from the White House about where they see the problem and potentially who they see the enemy is. They're standing behind Hegseth, but they're pointing as the problem being the entire rest of the Pentagon.
And what's the impact of all of this based on your reporting?
Right. A lot of impact. First, there's the job itself. Scores of Democrats are calling for Hegseth to resign, and that one Republican is Congressman Don Bacon of Nebraska, who says it's time for him to go. Behind the scenes, I am told by those at the Capitol with knowledge that they think the next 24 to 48 hours are the critical zone here. Now, of course, President Trump is in the driver's seat here regardless, but those in the national security sector say there are much greater impacts potentially, that this is a signal to our adversaries that perhaps it's an opportunity for them to ramp up counterintelligence, that there's problems here in the U.S. military sector that they could take advantage of. And also there's another issue here that it sends a message potentially to the military, where command and conduct are everything. We spoke to one expert who's worked in the Defense Department, Kori Schake from the American Enterprise Institute.
You know, if anybody wearing an American military uniform did what Secretary Hegseth has done, they would be drummed out of the service. They'd be lucky if they weren't court-martialed and sent to prison for it. And so the lack of respect for the rules of the institution and the culture of the institution is corrosive.
There's a debate over whether this signal chat was worthy of a court-martial, but everyone I spoke to today said yes, there would be severe consequences by anyone else in the military. Now, Schake also said no agency responds more quickly to political directives than the Pentagon. So blaming the Pentagon for being unresponsive does not really click with her. One more thing for the staff turnover. One former U.S. defense official that I spoke with told me that when there's uncertainty at the top of the Pentagon, it could cascade. So the issue now for Hegseth is whether he can quell all of this uncertainty, all of this seeming kind of turmoil around him in time to save his job and also to make sure there's no problems at the Pentagon.
Lisa Desjardins, thank you so much for this reporting. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments today in the latest challenge to the Affordable Care Act that could upend a key provision. At issue, the constitutionality of a task force that recommends what preventive care treatments should be covered by private insurance with no cost to patients. And it could have wide-ranging impacts on everything from cancer screening to HIV prevention medicine to counseling for expectant mothers. Following it all is Amy Howe, co-founder of SCOTUS Blog. Good to see you again, Amy.
Thanks for having me.
So before we jump into the details of the case, just remind us who's behind this case and how did it end up before the Supreme Court?
So the plaintiffs in this case are a couple of individuals and a couple of businesses who object to the requirement that health insurers provide coverage at no cost for what's known as PrEP. pre-exposure prophylaxis medicine, which are medicines that can help prevent the spread of HIV and are highly effective at doing so. They have religious objections because they say that these medicines encourage same-sex relationships and intravenous drug use. So they went to federal court challenging the requirements, arguing, among other things, that the structure of this task force violates the Constitution's Appointments Clause, which requires officers of the United States to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And the lower courts agreed with them. So the Biden administration came to the Supreme Court asking the justices to weigh in. The justices heard oral argument today. The Trump administration is now defending the structure of the task force.
So I want to underline that point here. The Trump administration is now defending part of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, after working to undo it for years. What is their argument?
So their argument is that these are what we call inferior officers who don't need to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, because the Secretary of Health and Human Services right now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., can remove these task force members at any time and exercise control over the task force's recommendations so that they don't become binding, essentially, without his saying so.
So they're fighting for him to keep the authority to be able to do that.
Exactly.
With the task force. And what is at stake here when it comes to this ruling?
Yeah, so it's, public health groups are on the same side as the Trump administration in this case. And they say that having these different kinds of medicines and screenings available at no cost has been really important in helping to stop the spread of all kinds of diseases and promote public health, because they say having these available at no cost really encourages people to get them. That if you take away this no-cost access, that people are much less likely to get these screenings and to take this medicine.
And some 150 million Americans have private health insurance in the country, too. So as you're listening to today's arguments, what stood out to you? Did you get a sense of which way the justices are leaning on this?
It's always difficult. You're going to take these things with a grain of salt to predict based on the oral argument. But it did seem like there was a majority of the justices, including some of the conservative justices like Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, who seemed inclined to say that these task force members don't have to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, to leave the task force as it is. There may be some questions that go back to the lower courts about exactly whether some statutory questions, and then some questions about what happens to some of the recommendations that the task force made between 2010, when the Obamacare was enacted, and 2023. And those are not insignificant questions, but the justices right now seemed inclined to rule for the Trump administration and not for the challengers.
And we will wait and see, of course. While we have you, I want to ask you about another big issue before the court. That's the Trump administration's deportation flights. There was a ruling on Saturday from the court that essentially pauses those flights for now. But one of the two justices who dissented, that's Justice Samuel Alito, said that the ruling was hastily and prematurely granted. How do you look at that? Why did they rule on this now?
Well, we don't know for sure, because the justices didn't provide any reasoning for their order. And that was another thing that Justice Alito sort of lamented in his dissent that came out on Saturday night. But, it seemed like they were concerned about the prospect that detainees could be removed from this northern district of Texas, and in particular, this Bluebonnet detention facility in Anson, Texas, to El Salvador or somewhere else out of the country, without the detainees having the kind of notice and opportunity to challenge their removal that the Supreme Court said in an order on April 7th that they were entitled to. And the detainees' lawyers filed a reply brief today. And in that reply brief, which was filed around 5:30 this morning, they said, this was not a false alarm. There is video and have been reports that there were, in fact, buses heading towards the airport that turned around after we made our filing in the Supreme Court.
Two big cases we know you'll keep track of and come back to update us. That is Amy Howe, co-founder of SCOTUS Blog, joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Trump administration's deportation agenda is causing some fractures among Democrats as they consider if and how to respond. For analysis of that and the other headlines, we turn now to our Politics Monday team. That is Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter and Tamara Keith of NPR. Great to see you both.
Good to be here.
So when we spoke with Maryland Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen last week, it was right before he was allowed to meet with the Maryland man who was deported to El Salvador, Kilmore Abrego Garcia. He was mistakenly deported by the Trump administration by their own admission. And as you both see, how Democrats handle this issue, whether they even touch it, has divided some in the party. Here's how California Governor Gavin Newsom framed it recently.
This is the distraction of the day. This is the debate they want. This is their 80-20 issue as they've described it. You know, those that believe in the rule of law defending it. But it's a tough case because people are they defending MS-13?
And here now is how Senator Van Hollen responded on Sunday's Meet the Press.
I don't think it's ever wrong to stand up for the Constitution. And this is not about one man. I think Americans are tired of elected officials or politicians who are all finger to the wind. And anybody who can't stand up for the Constitution and the right of due process doesn't deserve to lead.
Amy, what does all of this say to you about where Democrats are right now?
Right. Well, where Senator Van Hollen is where so many Democratic, especially Democratic voters, are sitting today, which is they are frustrated with what they see is ineffective and inadequate response to Donald Trump and many of the actions that he's taken. When you hear from Gavin Newsom, what he's saying, the governor of California, is, look, just talk about the economy. That's where we're winning. Donald Trump's numbers are really bad on the economy. They're good on immigration. But the whole issue is really how you ask the question on immigration and where the fight ultimately, what the fight ultimately ends up being about. If you ask voters, do you think Donald Trump's doing a good job on the economy? Generally, yes, he gets positive marks there, much higher than he is getting right now on the economy. But when you ask specifically about some of the things either that he's doing or saying that he's doing, including one that asks the question, do you think that he should be able to deport people if a court order tells him to stop it? Overwhelming majority say, no, he shouldn't be allowed to do that. So the question now is where this fight is happening. Is it happening about the rule of law, where Democrats would like it to be, or is it where Donald Trump thinks he is the strongest, believes he has a mandate, which is it's going to be about being able to deport criminals? And in the election in 2020 or 2024, this was the issue that constantly brought me back into contention.
Tam, how do you see it?
Yeah,
I mean, I think that this is a nuanced case that is being fought in an environment without nuance. And so you have the Trump White House very happily having this fight. The RNC earlier today sent out a thing calling, DIMS S13 or whatever. They're, saying that Democrats support gang members. And the Trump White House has labeled them terrorists. They aren't just gang members, they're terrorists. And so that is ground that the White House is happy to have a fight on. And they argue that Abrego Garcia is not a perfect person. And in fact, Democrats, I think, would concede that often the people that deserve due process aren't necessarily perfect people. Right. And so Democrats, though, are in a place where they are having to make an argument about due process in the Constitution when, as Amy says, the last election, lots of people made arguments about the Constitution, but those arguments ultimately were not as salient as arguments about be very worried about the state of your country and be very worried about the state of your pocketbook.
Yeah, on the related issue here that Tam raises, Amy, the Supreme Court did have to step in on a related case about immigration. It was temporarily blocking deportations President Trump is carrying out under that wartime Alien Enemies Act, which feeds this bigger question around President Trump versus the courts, right? The question of, is he abiding? Will he continue to comply by court orders? We hear a lot about this from constitutional law experts and from Democrats. Is that the kind of thing Americans are paying attention to?
Well, no, because not even constitutional law experts can agree on what exactly the line is between a constitutional crisis and a constitutional challenge, right? Are we at a boiling point, or are we sort of simmering, or is the pot now completely blowing up? where I think it comes down to voters, the question really, as I said, is at what point do these stories tend to break through? And this is where this is something of a gamble that Trump is taking, which is he believes that because this person who was sent to El Salvador, who shouldn't have been sent there by the law, is not a perfect person, voters are going to side with him. And that all the people who are getting deported are going to, or many of the people getting deported may fall into similar categories where it's going to be hard to make the case that these are perfect people. But if you start to see more and more, and we're seeing it, conservative legal scholars and others and judges come out and say, this is a rule of law issue, that may change perceptions of Trump on this very issue. In 2017, he wasn't that popular on immigration. He's more popular today on it.
Yeah, in a sense, he has moved public opinion on immigration as he has on some other things. But one issue, and I think this overlaps with some of the other things, is this was sort of sloppy. They admitted they made a mistake.
In the
and
deportation,
then
you mean?
In the deportation. And then they are doubling down on it. And there are other instances of people who are in that prison in El Salvador where their lawyers are saying, hey, wait, this wasn't a gang member. Right. So in as much as this becomes an issue of, well, you know, we support the idea, but could they be a little less sloppy about it? Are they carrying out their policy in a way that's effective? If the narrative becomes more about chaos than about, you know, efficient implementation of the law, then that could also become a problem for the White House.
Tam, speaking of chaos, at least reported chaos, but according to some people, I want to pick up where Lisa's earlier reporting left off, which is the scrutiny and the questions around the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth. Now that it's been revealed he used that unsecure messaging app, a commercial messaging app, to again share sensitive military information. You now have a Republican member of Congress, Don Bacon, stepping in, suggesting at least that Mr. Hegseth should step down, calling him an amateur. What do you expect to see happen next?
I think we could hear from other Republicans in Congress. We could also have a rallying around Mr. Hegseth. At this point, the White House is, at least publicly, digging in. Though the caveat I will deliver that I've delivered many times before is that people have President Trump's full and total support until they don't. And that can happen very quickly. And if he becomes more of a problem than it's worth, then the president could easily change his mind.
This is another one of those stories, very nuanced in its details, in an unnuanced environment. Is this the kind of thing resonating with
Well,
people?
I do think it goes back to that issue of chaos, right? Does it look like the administration is tackling things deliberately, decisively, or it looks sort of haphazard? I think the other difference between this case and, say, other times in Trump's first administration, where there were personnel challenges, is that this is coming basically from inside the House, right? It's loyalist on loyalist versus sort of the never Trump faction or the establishment faction against the Trump loyalists. So this makes it, I think, even a little harder for Hegseth to hold on because many of the people coming out against him and arguing that he should be let go are those who are also loyal to Trump and had supported Hegseth in the past.
We'll see where it goes next. Amy Walter, Tamara Keith, always great to see you both. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Earth Day is tomorrow, one of the key events in the environmental movement. It comes as a federal judge has temporarily blocked the EPA from canceling $14 billion in climate grants approved by the Biden administration, marking a setback to President Trump's agenda to freeze climate spending across the government. As part of our Tipping Point series, William Brangham spoke recently with a leading environmentalist about the opposition to Mr. Trump's plan for the climate.
2024 was the hottest year on record, capping a decade where almost every year broke the previous year's record high. Carbon emissions, which help drive that warming, are also at record levels. President Trump and his administration argue that this is not a problem and that trying to address it only hurts the economy and puts the U.S. at a competitive disadvantage. On his first day in office, President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accord. He's tried to freeze billions in funding for clean energy projects, wants to boost coal production, and declared a, quote, national energy emergency to increase domestic fossil fuels. While Trump's actions face legal challenges, environmentalists are sounding the alarm. and among them is Bill McKibben. He's the author of several books on climate change, the founder of the grassroots climate campaign called 350.org, and Third Act, which organizes older Americans to work on climate justice. Bill McKibben, great to have you on the program. What are some of your greatest immediate concerns about the Trump administration?
Well, William, we're seeing an incredible rollback pretty much of all environmental regulation dating back to 1970. We're coming up on the 55th anniversary of Earth Day, and it was in the immediate aftermath of that we started basically regulating pollution, and now we're deregulating pollution of all kinds. The most serious consequences are what's happening around climate and energy, and they're serious for two reasons. One, as you say, the planet is getting hotter and hotter and hotter all the time. March was the hottest March we've ever measured on this planet. And two, we're making a series of extremely foolish choices about energy. We're the only place in the world that's decided that somehow coal is the future of the planet, and we're going to have our lunch eaten by the rest of the world, which is quite rightly figured out that sun and wind and the batteries to store their power when the sun goes down or the wind drops are the cheapest, cleanest, easiest, fastest way forward. So on both counts, we're making just the most savage mistakes.
It also seems the administration is defunding a lot of the scientific investigation into climate change and how it might play out into the future.
Yes, look, the U.S. was the place where we first understood what was happening. We were the first people to measure carbon in the atmosphere. The people that built the computer models that helped us gave us the warnings about what was coming. And those are precisely the programs that are now being chopped off. Even the programs where we measure the amount of carbon in the atmosphere or the temperature of the earth are under assault, as if by not measuring it, it might go away. But that's not how physics works. There are a series of questions, a series of issues where people can differ in their opinions. And I'm at odds with the Trump administration about many issues, but this isn't a question of opinions. This is a question of physics and of chemistry, well understood physics and chemistry, and willfully blinding ourselves to it has to rank high on the list of dumbest things that governments have ever done.
What about the argument that this administration makes that the concerns about climate change and the impacts it will have on our world are, they argue, exaggerated or overblown or so far in the distance that to exert energy and money to address them is an enormous cost?
Tell that, first of all, to the good people of Los Angeles, say, who watched large parts of their city burn after the hottest, driest weather on record. But then also go talk to the people in the insurance industry who are canceling policies up and down, east and west across this country because climate change has so scrambled their ability to predict what's going to happen that they can no longer figure out how to make a going business of writing insurance. If you don't think that's an economic drag on us going forward, you haven't paid much attention to how capitalism works. Insurance is an absolutely key part of where we are. The real bottom line, though, is that we could be making huge positive steps right now. We live on a planet where, as of 3 or 4 years ago, the cheapest way to make power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. The solar cell, an American invention at Bell Labs in 1954, is the most important piece of technology on the planet. But right at the moment, we're ceding all that to the Chinese, who are building something like 2/3 of all the clean energy on planet Earth. They're going to own the future, and we're going to have some coal mines.
The administration argues that all of the talk about the harms that climate change is causing and will cause into the future is exaggerated, and that is what is driving this climate anxiety documented among the young people of this world. What do you say to that?
I spend a lot of time with young people, and what I find makes them anxious is the fact that nobody in authority now is doing anything to address what's obviously the biggest danger facing their future. They're not stupid. You can't wish this away. They've been studying physics and chemistry in school. What they want is people in leadership to stand up and show them that they take seriously what scientists are saying. We got a warning from science. We got it in time to act. So far, we have ignored that warning, and that is truly, truly sad, and it should make us anxious.
All right, that is Bill McKibben of 350.org and Third Act. Always great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
William, a great pleasure.
And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Amna Nawaz.
And I'm Jeff Bennett. For all of us here at the PBS NewsHour, thanks for spending part of your evening with us.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by friends of the NewsHour, including Robert Kaplan and Kathy and Paul Anderson.
Cunard is a proud supporter of public television. On a voyage with Cunard, the world awaits. A world of flavor, diverse destinations, and immersive experiences. A world of leisure and British style. All with Cunard's White Star service.
In 1995, two friends set out to make wireless coverage accessible to all. With no long-term contracts, nationwide coverage, and 100% US-based customer support. Consumer Cellular. Freedom calls.
The John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. More information at macfound.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.